Okay, everyone, welcome to another video review. You will have already seen how I put this masterpiece together. I'm going to upload that video before this more formal review video. Now that you've seen me put it together, this video will concentrate on just sort of talking about the piece, what I like about it, the goods and the concerns and that type of thing. So this, just to kind of start things off, this to me is one of my favorite Magnetos. This is my first Magneto statue, actually, and it is one of my favorites. There might be a couple coming along that may challenge for the title, depending, but until it actually, comes into my hands, painted and finished, then this for me is the best Magneto statue that's out there, custom or licensed. Now, when you talk about Magneto statues, it's kind of an interesting story in and of itself. I'll start sort of rotating him around while I talk about this. There's not a lot of statues, or there weren't a lot of statues of Magneto in the day, to the point where I know quite a few people had to custom create one. They had to commission sculptors and painters to actually do the work because licensed companies just weren't making him, which now is a little bit of a joke because he's one of the most popular characters ever to be made. A lot of custom groups make him. A lot of the licensed companies have jumped on the bandwagon. You even got XM putting out a white Magneto version, which is bananas when you think about how far we've come. When there was nothing really out there, it was one very, very poor comiquette 1/5 scale that Sideshow put out years ago. But the game sort of changed when XM Studios from Singapore put out their Magneto sitting on the Sentinel hand. This was one of the more famous throne type pieces, along with Sideshow's original Grail Dr. Doom on throne. And this was sort of XM's coming out party. It retailed for $800, but because XM did not have distribution rights in America, you had to pay quite a bit more to get it imported here. And since then, it's become sort of a statue grail, inflating into thousands of dollars. Even now, after all these other Magneto statues have come out, getting an XM Studios Magneto on Sentinel for $2,000 is still considered actually a pretty fair price even now. And so that Magneto is often considered sort of the best one out there. And for me personally, I've had opportunities to get it, and I've always kind of held off. Because for me, I've always still thought of Magneto and the essence of his character, not as someone sort of sitting and brooding on a throne. But when I think of Magneto, and he is one of my favorite villains, I think of him using his powers of magnetism. I see him floating in the air. I see that as my more kind of definitive statue. And I wasn't willing to spend thousands on one of him essentially lounging on a Sentinel hand, no matter how cool the sculpt, how nice the detail, etc. Which, by the way, was the same reason I sold the original Dr. Doom on Throne from Sideshow, because while the throne was gorgeous, I believe it was sculpted by Vigiano, Pablo Vigiano, who's a tremendous talent many years ago. While the throne is amazing, Doom himself and his cloth cloak and hood was a little bit bland, in my opinion. Well, when it comes to Magneto, it's really difficult then if your idea of him is sort of floating and using his magnetism powers. It's kind of hard to pull that off in statue form. And there have been, quite a few. Even Bowen Designs had a 1/6 scale version that was pretty nice. Iron Studios had one of him floating or levitating and throwing a girder through the eye of a Sentinel. I believe it was a little bit smaller scale. So there have been attempts, but they're very tricky to do because at the end of the day, obviously, what you have to consider, is that in terms of engineering design, you can't make something float. There's gravity at play here. And so how the challenge when creating Magneto or other types of characters that, fly, whose more iconic poses involve flight, like say Superman, or let's just say Sentry, or any of those types of, characters, is how do you give the illusion of levitation or the illusion of the piece being in midair, while obviously having to, you have to create obviously a bridge to the base, right? And then for Magneto, of course, it's complicated by the additional challenge of also trying to incorporate his powers of magnetism, which means that it's not enough just to get him to float. You also have to think about trying to get the stuff around him to float as well. That's a really, really big challenge to pull off. And of course, XM rather famously kind of sidestepped that by simply having him sit down on the Sentinel hand and then, using a little bit of depth perception illusion to have him look like he's levitating Cerebro, for instance. And so this piece came along. It's sculpted by the magnificent talent Daniel Bell, who has put together in a pretty short time, he's put together an amazing portfolio of killer sculpts. He's a digital sculptor. He's very good at what he does. And now he's actually being used quite a bit by the licensed companies like Sideshow and among others. So he doesn't really do, I don't think, custom pieces anymore for obvious reasons. And now that you're being paid by a licensed company, it would not be the smartest thing to do to keep on doing custom commissions. But this is kind of, I think, what, in a way catapulted him to fame. This kind of put his name on the map. And the company that created it, I don't know if I should say, I think I have the right to say it, but I'll just let it be. It's pretty well known what custom group produced this. This is also kind of one of their best pieces. They've done some pretty nice ones too in the past, by the way, but this is sort of, I think, again, their signature piece. It's kind of what catapulted them into fame. It's certainly what led me to even learn about them. And so this is, again, sort of history repeating itself, where Magneto becomes this coming out party of a group. The Magneto on Sentinel, sort of for XM Studios, and this one for this custom group. But I think credit enough to just the sculptor, Daniel Bell, for bringing this to life. So now let's begin by talking about the statue little by little, methodically. So the first thing I'd like to discuss is, I guess, the scenario, the situation. Again, if you know about Magneto's history, you'll know, he has a very horrible, tragic backstory. Parents killed, by the Germans, by the Nazis. World War II, losing his wife, losing a daughter. I will not belabor all those details. You can just Google or Wikipedia that yourself. The conceit behind this statue is that he has returned to an Auschwitz concentration camp, unleashing his magnetic powers in a fury. And you're basically seeing, again, the barbed wire fences exploding out, the steel girders essentially coming under his control, stuff coming out of the ground, the whole 9 yards. You see him levitating, with his hand outstretched, exerting his powers of magnetism. So again, very, very nice pose. So that's the backstory behind it. The box art actually comes with a little interesting, mini biography of him. The first thing is just to look at the base. It's the easiest thing to kind of go over. So this piece has a beautiful base, very, very well painted with a lot of, not only detail, but just a lot of just interesting things put in it to give it character, so to speak. It's a fine line to toe because you don't want to have a base that's just ridiculously plain, like a simple black base. Some people like that, and it's quite nice for, say, museum style poses. But, for this type of piece, you want it to have a little bit more going on, but at the same time, you don't want it to be a hodgepodge, like a big mess where everything but the kitchen sink, for instance, is thrown in and just kind of distracts and detracts from the central character. So here, I think they struck a perfect blend or perfect balance of it. You kind of see here, trying to get an idea what this could be. It does feel like some sort of a tarp, At first I thought it was a cloak, and it still might be that, but it could also just be, a piece of cloth or something that's haphazardly strewn on the ground. It looks very nice. You have the realistic wrinkles of the cloth. Here you have the stone detail. Again, they did a great job sculpting and painting it. You can clearly see the different textures of the stones. You can see the skulls in the earth. And it's just very rocky, very organic. You can see the steel girders jutting out, and they're coming out because of Magneto's power. In the background, you see the German helmets, which clearly give you this context of where he is. You see this huge jagged girder coming all the way out of the ground like others, and this of course serves as the main fixation point for the statue up top. Here again, you see little tiny core, steel poles. Again, very organically jutting out. And even though all of this is resin, they do a great job painting it and weathering it, so it really looks like metal. So whoever sculpted, obviously Daniel sculpted it, but the paint job was also at the factory level pretty impressive that they're able to give this paint job. They're so convincingly, showcases it, makes you think it really is metal. Here goes some more stone work. A little bit deeper in, again, you can see the skulls on the base of the pillars from the poor concentration camp victims. More steel, for lack of a better term, more steel poles, again, being, manipulated by him. And then when you take a step back, you can then take a look at the fence. So we're gonna look at the fence from the back side right here. So 3 big stone pillars, the one here, the one in the middle, and then the shorter one, of course, all the way over here. When you look at the base, you can still continue to see girders sticking out of the ground. It obviously gives you the impression of a tremendous amount of damage. Now, whether he had happened upon this already in ruins or he created this is kind of a matter of conjecture and up to imagination. But the effect is supposed to be that he's in the center, unleashing his magnetic force, and the power of that is basically pushing outward in a bubble. And so the barbed wire should be coming out at you, should be bowled out. You can see the stone here also being pushed out, of course, in the center. If you know how concrete pillars are made, you'll know that they're always reinforced by these steel pillars on the inside as well, the steel scaffolding. And so there's steel in the concrete, and that's what's kind of cracking the columns and pushing it outward. So it's a very, very nice effect. I'm gonna back out a little bit and just kind of spin them around. So again, you can see a lot of that detail. At the bottom here, you can see again the steel scaffolding being exposed as the top part of the stone is gone. Another skull at the bottom, and then a German helmet. Also interesting that you see this particular steel bar. See how it's up, and then it basically moves away and is pushed out. Again, this is supposed to show you the power of the magnetism force at work that is warping the steel away from him. Or at least that's how I interpret it. Maybe I'm telling a better story than the sculptor intended, but that's the beauty of that work, okay? So again, kind of giving you a little bit of detail from a different perspective, from the back angle. So, and then of course, in terms of all of that, you then have to have the steel metal plates attached to the different columns. And again, all of this is to give you the impression that magnetism is at work, and that the metal parts around this concentration camp is now being floating up. It'll be lifted up, being pushed out by his power. So you can see obviously the metal here, the metal here, the metal here, and it's like rising up. Okay, and then we're gonna turn it around, and you can clearly see again the metal over here as well. So very cunningly hidden, there's these little tiny little cracks that you know, again, if you weren't looking for them, you may actually miss them, and they're just there for you to just slot some of these pieces in. So from far away, you really do get the impression that these metallic parts are lifting up and is kind of, in midair exploding from him. And it's very interesting because, when you see it here, you know that it's kind of attached here. But that's only if you, for instance, take a shot of him from the side, right? But when you're looking at him head on, and of course here at this angle, it looks like this piece is floating. This piece is very cunningly put on his leg. It looks like it's floating. So from different angles, you'll get different types of illusions. But from the front angle, when you're watching him, when you're seeing him from this angle right here, where he's looking at you, and you back up enough, it really does look like the pieces of metal are floating in midair. You can see where they're attached to the cape, but they've sculpted the metal in such a fashion that it really looks like they're slowly levitating. It's a very powerful effect, and it's done extremely well, this kind of optical illusion. And so I think now is a good time to just sort of talk about the overall effect of the floating, the floating device, so to speak. How do you make him look like he's rising up in the air? I already talked again about the magnetism effect that they kind of that Daniel created. Very nicely done, again, with the barbed wire. And, they put a lot of time into this. The wire really is wire, and they had to drill these microscopically thin little holes, and then they ask you, the collector, to actually take the time to put each of these pieces in little by little. It's supposed to come with 7 pieces of wire. Excuse me. It's supposed to come with 7 pieces of wire if you look at the instruction manual, but it actually comes with 9. And I think one of them is really important. You want to put it right over here. There's a hole for it. You put this here, and again, it kind of continues that illusion of the entire fence at the same level. And then there's one extra piece that I chose to just sort of hang over here as if it's just a random broken piece of barbed wire that's just hanging there from its magnetism, destroying the fence. So the barbed wire adds to the effect, again, of the magnetism, pushing everything back. I talked about the steel plates that they cunningly placed on the cape, his leg, on the pillars, to again, even on the ground, again, give you the impression that it's all rising up. And these little pieces are very important to, again, give you that illusion. But for Magneto himself, how did they do it? Well, they try to do this in a couple of different ways. So let's go over that. So first of all, you have to make sure, of course, that this leg is very strongly supported in its base right here. They do this with a very thick steel peg that goes all the way through and up here. There are going to be some issues with this, which I'll go over at the end of the video. But the conceit is you have an incredibly strong fixation point right over here. Now, number 2, now that you have this here, it would be best, the idea of having an incredibly strong fixation point over here is then to ideally leave this completely floating free in midair. As you can see, that's not the case. Again, we'll revisit this situation at the end of the video. So you have that floating so that you only have them on one point, and then you angle the foot downward to, again, minimize the look of the contact between the foot and the base. And then you have to sculpt Magneto himself and his body in a way that gives it a sense of weightlessness. You want to give that sensation. And so this is where Daniel Bell did an amazing job, because the way, again, I talked about this before in my previous videos, which is that one of the biggest challenges of sculpting statues is how do you give it the illusion of accurate movement. A statue standing in a museum pose or in a Captain Morgan pose is relatively easy to do because you don't have to have that statue do anything. All the anatomy is at rest. when you make a statue move, whether he or she is jumping, flying through the air, running, or in this case, floating through the air, using his hands and just kind of concentrating, getting that magnetic power, controlling the magnetism, it becomes really, really hard to do. The minute you screw up, it looks fake. The pose looks unnatural. It could look stilted. You really have to be very good with anatomy, do a lot of homework, a lot of study to pull that off. And so, Daniel Bell did an amazing job. It really looks like Magneto is angry. He's using his right hand as a focal point. He's raising up to the heavens. This hand is all spread eagled and open out. He looks like he's calling his powers into focus, and then the way his back is arched slightly, okay, and the way his legs and the fact his boots are sort of pointed downward. All of these things, the arch again of his back, the way his hips are placed, the way his legs are pointing apart, and the feet or the boots slightly, pointing downward. All of these things give you the illusion of flotation, the illusion that he's floating in midair. In addition, you have this gorgeous cape that's all sculpted, and it has to be sculpted because the flow of the cape and the way that cape goes away from him. You can see from here, backing up, you can see all of that moving. That flotation of the cape gives you another illusion of movement. It gives you the illusion of either the wind blowing or the magnetism, working, creating these forces of air, and then it's billowing out. And of course, you have to have the cape be solid to attach these metallic plates on them. So it looks like, again, everything is floating up. So the combination of his pose, of his body anatomy, and the cape itself is what gives you this amazing feeling that he's levitating, okay? And even though I put this, cunningly sculpted rock pillar to support his left foot, that actually, you would think that would really kind of take away from the illusion, but believe it or not, it doesn't, because the sculpt of the body and the cape and the sculpt of that pose is so good that you still buy into the fact that he's floating. It still looks like he's floating. That and the fact that Daniel Bell very cunningly created the contact points to really sort of minimize, where it's hitting the base. And from certain angles, the rock here, for instance, here, the color here, when you step back, this sort of blends in with the base and almost looks from this viewpoint, again, like he's floating. It does almost this optical illusion. It looks like the little pillar he's standing on maybe is further behind him or on the ground, and it still gives you the impression that he's floating. And again, it's because of the way he angled the foot. And even though on the side, you can clearly tell from this angle that it's attached here, but from this angle, it's not so obvious. Again, trickery with depth perception and illusion. And that's kind of, for me, what really sells this piece and makes it so remarkable is, again, the really amazing base. A lot of the setup, a lot of the labor, so to speak, is putting all these little accents on the base, the skulls, the helmets, the free floating pieces of metal, putting those pillars in, and then applying the metal, for instance, like right over here, this metal piece right here, applying the metal onto the pillars to, again, give you the illusion of magnetism, the illusion of flotation, taking the time to painstakingly thread and place all the barbed wire to create the illusion of the fence. This base is sort of perfect in the sense that it gives you so much to look at, so much to talk about. It tells a story, but it creates this natural environment that doesn't actually detract from Magneto himself. And also adds to the story because done properly, it's supposed to give you, again, the illusion of magnetism at work. And it doesn't dominate the actual statue, it doesn't dominate the subject matter, both because it's so well planned out, it adds to him, but also because Magneto himself then is so well done. And at the end of the day, that starts with the pose and the cape and all that. The cape in itself is as big as he is, and the cape is almost a character as well. You know, when you take a look at what it's doing, the swirling of it, the size of it, you have to really, you know, almost stand back to get a proper appreciation for that. So I'm, you know, standing way back. You can see him floating from there. You can just kind of see what that cape is doing. It's a massive cape, as big as the statue itself. And so you can't, it's very hard to dominate something like this when the central you know, figure is also so beautifully made and has such presence in and of itself. And the presence is because of the cape and the pose. Now we can always, again, talk a little bit more now about the detail. He's in his standard comic suit. It's digitally sculpted, which means there's a lot of texture. You can see the texture here along the sides. His muscles are reasonably accurate. They might be a little bit too muscular, but it's not like there's like no muscles where they shouldn't belong. Here you have the pectoralis, major muscles, and you have the rectus abdomini very, very well sculpted. You can actually see the tiny little wrinkles of the skin-tight suit against him, bicep, tricep, deltoids. So, you know, the anatomy is, you know, pretty accurate. Now, does Magneto really look like a world-class bodybuilder slash marathon runner with a 2% body fat? Well, that's, you know, that's debatable, of course, but the anatomy as interpreted by Daniel Bell is certainly accurate, in my opinion. Here you go, over here. Here you have sort of the little bits of armor, back musculature as well, which you can't see very well because of the cape. But I'll show you here. Definitely, you know, didn't take any shortcuts. Here again, the boots, the texturing of the uniform. So again, down here in the crotch area, you know, a lot of texturing here, and over here, of course, texturing right over here. So very nice detail, actually, you know, for all of that. It's not just blocky colors. You know, you go real deep, you can see that. The cape actually goes over the head. There's a little tiny place here where you put the head. Also done pretty nicely as well, okay? The cape itself now, while the sculpt is magnificent, the cape itself, you know, is a little crude. Sometimes as with customs, it is not quite as refined, but still, you know, acceptable, pretty good. It could be, you know, it's a little bit rough in some areas, you know, these lines and stuff like that, the paint, the texturing could be a little bit better. But again, the actual sculpt itself of the cape is amazing. And one of the best capes, really, I've ever seen, because that's the standard for capes. And therein also, of course, created one of the problems or issues was because they were so ambitious with the size of the cape, because it was so important to the art design of the piece. Again, I told you the cape is really what sells the levitation as well. With the metal attached to it, the billowing of it, it's a really important part of it. And so you have to have that along with his pose. So as far as this goes, I think I've really done, already done a pretty reasonably thorough job talking about the base details, talking about the quality of the sculpt itself, talking about the cape, the pose, all of that. This is why, you know, to me, when I first saw the statue, I immediately just felt like this is the best Magneto I've ever seen. The pose, the levitation effect, it's almost like everything I want in a Magneto piece, this gave me. So very, very pleased with it. Now, let's take a look at the head. So there's the 4 heads, which in my opinion could be a little bit of overkill. Again, a lot of custom companies sort of head in this direction. So this head is of him, of course, in full armor with his helmet. His eyes are white, as you would expect when he's, you know, angry and fully using his powers of magnetism. This is my favorite head. I really like this. So this is sort of the effect, and you're supposed to pose him like that. So he's looking at you head on, and this kind of optimizes the illusion and gives it the full effect. So let's take a step back. You can really get this feel of that. There, of course, are the heads. You've seen that, so it's magnetized. So all you gotta do is grip it firmly, take the magnet off. Here I can give you a close-up of the head. there's been some complaints of the paint job in some people, and I think that I don't think that deserves it. This is a very, very good paint job. It's reminiscent of the one on the Vizian Punisher. They use translucent resin, which I applaud them for. Sideshow tried using translucent resin many, many years ago, and they couldn't really find a painter who knew to do a good enough job to take advantage of that translucent resin. And this created a lot of problems, actually. But I think that the factory did a very nice job giving that kind of skin-like texture. And the whole point of translucent resin is you paint it in a subtle enough way. If you know what you're doing, it almost feels like a silicon head. And I think, while it could be a little bit better, I think they did a bang-up job, Ace's job, as far as that goes. So this is the angry helmeted head. We then, of course, have the angry unhelmeted head, which is nice. It gives you a lot more detail of the hair. They did a great job with the salt and pepper hair. And now it kind of gives you a better idea of his facial anatomy right here. In certain pictures with flash or whatnot, it gives him the illusion that he has greasy skin, or there's it's too bright. But in person, when you look at it, that's not the case at all. It's very naturalistic. It does feel like skin. Excellent paint job, in my opinion. Now, if you don't like that style, then certainly you can have it repainted. There's any number of very, very good paint masters out there in all corners of the world who give you a standard prototype level quality paint job. But again, doing so, you sort of remove the translucency, the skin. The best regular paint jobs, I don't care who it is, but the best of the best, was it James Tissot or John Allred or anyone, it's a different type of effect that you're going for if you just have a regular, resin head. You can't do that with translucent resin. So there's an intrinsic limitation to what can be done with regular resin paint-ups that you can't achieve with that, and you can only achieve properly painting a translucent resin head. And so, in my opinion, it's a little bit of a waste doing a routine paint-up on translucent resin. It's there, take advantage of it. So anyways, that's my opinion as far as that goes. I'm happy enough with the job they did over here. If you want it better, and especially at the translucent level, there's people out there who can, but it gets very expensive, like $250 to $300 per head. You got 4 heads or 2 or 3 heads. You're looking at almost the cost of the entire statue just repainting the head. So I think, again, this is, if you look at it, very, very nicely done. You put it here, lock it in place, and then that's what he looks like. I'm going to back up again. So again, a very nice effect. Kind of changes things a little bit when you have the unmasked version. Still very beautiful. Excellent. Impression here, okay? So I'm going to take this head off, and then we'll talk about Magneto with a helmet on and more calm. And so the important thing here is that because his eyes are no longer white, you now have to put a little bit more detail there. They did a great job. There's you can see it's blue, right? Hopefully from this angle you can tell that's blue eyes. You don't see his teeth anymore. By the way, the teeth is also very well done. I mean, I think I should take a point out that this is very nicely done teeth, nicely painted, pretty realistic. But here, of course, you change out the teeth for the eyes. So his lips are closed, but very, very beautiful eyes, a little bit of just the right amount of gloss, very lifelike. Let's take a look at and see what he looks like putting here. Again, very nice magnets. All of the magnets are very strong, like rare earth magnets. They snap right in. So from here, you can see, again, a very different impression. So pretty amazing. Each head sort of gives you a very, very distinct look, a very, very distinct feel. It does add, obviously, a little bit of price to the overall statue. And sometimes you could feel like maybe it's a little bit overkill. But in this case, I think it really does add quite a bit to the display option as you begin to switch him around. Now, this is, of course, the version of him without the helmet. Again, very nice work on the eyes, good work on the translucency, good paint job, okay, overall, very good paint job. One of the advantages, again, they only made 97 of these, of which mine is numbered 29 out of 97. They only made about 97 numbered of these. Beware of unnumbered ones. Beware of so-called artist proofs, because those could be recasts. That's how recasters get around the limitations. They just say, oh, you got an extra special piece, it's not numbered. So be wary of that. Unless you have a good pedigree, tracing it back to the original producers, I would be wary of so-called unnumbered APs. But when you only make a few of these, a low number, then you're able to obviously spend more time on the quality. Sideshow makes 3,000, you make 97. Guess what? The factory, even if they're not going to be prototype level, they're going to be able to spend a bit more time painting and looking at the quality control. Some statues are even more limited. You create 50, 40, 30, you're going to get basically prototype paint jobs for some of these pieces, because they have the ability to look at each one separately versus 300 versus 3,000, So again, nice angle from here. I'm going to show you. This is what he looks like, unmasked, looking down, calm. So they each have their own charm. They each have their own effect. Like you said, my personal favorite, of course, is with the helmet on and him angry, because it kind of fits in my mind what he's doing here. But you've seen Magneto unleash magnetic powers looking calm too, and wreaking a lot of destruction. So it works either way. So those are the heads. The portraits are really important, because I mentioned again before that the portrait sort of makes the statue, makes the piece a good paint job, a good portrait. It ties everything together, and they certainly did not fail on that. Daniel Val did a phenomenal job with this comic accurate, head. And I know there are, of course, every time you have situations like these, we have change out heads. There are other heads out there. There are other custom heads out there. I think more Jim Lee style or whatever. I've seen a couple of them, and they're beautiful. They're very good. But in my opinion, I don't think you really need them. It adds a little bit of icing to the cake, so to speak, a little bit of flavor to the piece. But I think the heads that you get with this piece are more than good enough already. Okay, so with that said, and with me just putting out there that this is, again, my favorite Magneto statue because of everything put together, the base, the detailing, and again, the fact that he is, in my opinion, one of the most believable and organic depictions of him floating in midair, along with the best example of his magnetic power. This is my favorite Magneto statue, and in my opinion, probably the best on the market right now, as far as that goes. Now that throne can obviously be taken away. I don't own every Magneto out there. I don't own a very famous one of him, of course, on a Sentinel head. Is it a Sentinel head? No, I'm sorry. It's of him floating on a Sentinel hand. I don't own the Mad X Magneto over the skeleton of Wolverine. It's a very famous one as well. And of course, XM has a white Magneto coming out, and XM is pretty good at creating magnetism effects. And there's others coming along with him, for instance, one of them floating in midair. That looks really nice. So there's others coming out, and maybe that will dethrone this one. But for now, this is the one I own. This is the one I see in the flesh, so to speak. It's my favorite one. And I think it's the favorite of a lot of people. It's not a controversial statement. This is definitely, one of the best out there. And if the XM one is like maybe 1A or 1B, this is the other one. This is 1B if Magneto on Throne or Magneto on the Sentinel hand. The XM one is 1A. This is certainly 1B. It kind of just depends on what you prefer. But as far as it goes, this is what I think of when I think of Magneto. It's the perfect representation of him in action to me. So enough of the gushing. Hopefully I've given you enough description, enough panning while I've been talking, so that you get an idea of the quality of the piece, of the quality of the resin, the paint jobs, the engineering, the art direction, all of that. So now we come to the part of the review where I do want to talk about some nitpicks, some issues. It ranges from, the minor, because I do believe in being thorough and being objective, to some pretty serious things that, buyers of this need to understand and need to know. The first thing is, I do feel like it would be nice if Some of the add-on pieces had a little bit more magnetism. They have magnets around, but there's others where, like this, for instance, was not magnetized. And it kind of begs the question, why not? I mean, you already have the resources to do it. Why don't you just make everything magnetized? Like this thing here, it's just a little slot. You fit it in, and then all of a sudden it can fall out. It would be nice, for instance, if you just went the extra mile, made a little magnet here. Boop, it just slots right in. It's nicer. The helmets I can forgive because, again, you want them obviously, kind of a certain, you want the helmet in a certain orientation, and you're using the brim of the helmet to put it in. It fits pretty nicely. But I think it would be nice, again, with a little bit of extra magnets here and there to make sure everything slots in nicely. So that's one criticism, admittedly a very small one, a little bit nitpicky. The second is, while it does come with instructions, some of the instructions were a little bit unclear. There was one or two pieces, for instance, one where it was showing you where this guy is supposed to go. That was a little bit unclear. They made a little bit too much of a enlarged shot of the cape, and it took a while, for me to kind of figure out what's going on. It would be very nice if, for part of the manual, they actually had a picture of the completely assembled statue from different angles, so you can always refer to that to also get an idea of what things are supposed to look like. These three, rods were basically, bunched up in a group, even though they're different lengths, and so it does create a situation where you have to sort of mix and match a little bit. Not the end of the world, not a big deal, but these are little things that could make putting him together quite a bit easier. Now, having said that, let's come to the major the major issue with this piece. Were not for that, this piece would be perfect. The video would be over essentially. I just wouldn't be able to think of really anything else bad to say about it. The magnet stuff, really small, nitpicky. The better instruction manual, sure, but again, very, very minor stuff. The cape could be, a finish of the cape could be a little bit nicer. It could be a little bit more detail on the cape. The paint job a little bit more nuanced, but again, all of that is pretty ridiculous complaints when you look at the overall magnificent art direction, unique art direction, and quality of the piece. But this next, this next critique, this next one is a pretty major one, and you have to take it into account. So again, I mentioned this when trying to put him together, and we're going to go a little bit more in depth now and talk about how you can deal with this. So here goes. This statue in floating form, levitating, is supposed to be ideally supported in the following manner. Big rod here, main support. Right leg, okay? Left leg, nothing. This thing here, optional, take it away. It will then maximize the levitation effect because one leg obviously is hanging midair. The cape is supposed to be resting, and this cape is one of the heaviest parts of the entire statue. The weight of this cape, so it all flows. We need the cape to be sculpted, and we need it to be sculpted because we want to create a certain illusion. We want to create a certain effect. We want to attach floating pieces of metal to it. That cape has to be this big. It has to be, sculpted. But then you create an engineering problem. That is heavy. And you didn't make it out of plastic. It might have been reasonable, at least in this case, to make it out of maybe vinyl to decrease the weight. Unfortunately, I think it's made out of resin. So when you do this, it does create significant weight. How are you going to deal with the weight? Because now this leg, this rod in this leg, not only has to support Magneto himself, and he is off center. his center of gravity is actually located right over here because of the body, the arm, the other leg. The center of gravity is way off. And now you put a cape that's even more over to the left. Now the center of gravity is not here. It's more like right over here. So this tremendous amount of weight and pressure is weighing it down, and it's just basically exerting a lot of force on this, this part right here, his shins, his ankles, his lower leg, this area. All that weight from the cape, the body, the leg, the arm, everything is trying to bend this area and get it to basically topple. How are you going to prevent that? Okay, so to prevent it is to address the cape. You have to give the cape a bit more support. How are they going to do that? Well, there are pegs underneath here. Again, I'm not going to repeat too much because you saw me do this when I put them together. The peg slots under the statue this way, and then in the back, you have this little tiny steel peg. It's actually a stroke of genius because it's camouflaged almost like one of the steel, framework or the steel infrastructure inside the concrete. It might look like, say, one of this, right? So on initial inspection, you don't think anything of it. But that little tiny peg is supposed to go in this little tiny hole right here. This peg goes in this hole, and now you have another area of support, another area of fixation. And then finally, down here, you see this little long rod coming out of the steel pillar, again, part of the infrastructure. This thing is very close to touching the cape right over here. So technically the cape is now resting on this guy right over here, and this is another little area of support. So between 1, 2, and then back here, 3, we now have the extra little bit of support for this heavy cape, and you're hoping that that's enough to prevent this guy from eventually leaning or toppling. That's the idea behind this. That's the plan, okay? Now the question is, does this actually work? Unfortunately, in my opinion, I don't think it does. And depending on who you talk to, it's either a universal problem or it's a problem that kind of affects different collectors depending on what they got, the particular statue they got, or where they live. So let me explain. The reason this doesn't work is that in order for this to do so, you have to understand, whatever I just showed you, even if it worked perfectly, the main support has to be here, okay? And to make it really work, you have to make the rod very thick, and the cast, essentially, I'm not kidding, I think the cast from the leg, literally from the hip, from here all the way down to the foot, this has to be solid resin, solid cast resin. The reason is because, he's floating, and his lower leg is actually rather thin. It's rather slender, like just like this. This is how big that leg is. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's supposed to be slender. He's not the Hulk. Okay, he's not Captain America. So yes, it's supposed to be slender, but when it's slender, and then you make the resin hollow, which we have confirmation it's hollow, okay, because another collector had to snap in half when doing the repair. They looked at it, it's hollow. Then the problem here is you might have a very strong metal rod, but when the resin around it is hollow, it does not have the strength to hold everything we just talked about. And over time, that resin is going to begin to slowly warp and begin to essentially bend under the pressure that we just talked about. Now, depending on where you live, this may happen very, very slowly, or maybe not even at all. I don't know. I happen to live in Southern California in a desert environment, place with very, very low humidity, and it's in a temperature controlled room. So I haven't had very many problems with leaning. I think maybe one statue in my entire life, a cheap little DC Direct Supergirl that went from here all the way here. That's it. Most of my other statues, even statues known for leaning, has never leaned. But you don't want to take your chances really on that. So number one, understand that the support here, because of just the way the factory made it, it's a little bit shaky, okay? They got the rod, but they didn't get the solid cast of the leg, which in my opinion is very important. Yes, it adds weight. It does add weight, and you don't want weight, but it's a trade-off. You need to have the solidity of that cast to maintain the structural integrity of this leg, because this leg is holding everything else up, and they didn't do that. They made it hollow. You now lose that structural integrity, and you increase drastically the chances that this is going to bend and eventually snap, right? Right about here is my guess, okay? So now you may ask yourself, well, what about the other two supports? What about those two areas you talked about that could offer some advantage? Well, there's a couple of things wrong with this. The first is, as you can see for me, it doesn't line up, okay? Look at the hole right here. In order for this hole to fit into this peg, this entire cape has to be essentially rotated like this way. And there is no amount of blow drying that's going to get that cape to fit Magneto when he himself is already placed through that right foot. At first I thought maybe, Mags is already leaning a little bit. Maybe he's just leaning maybe 2 millimeters or 3 millimeters because the previous collector, didn't use the support structure. But when you look at everything perfectly, that's not true. This is less than a millimeter gap between the foot and here. When I made the putting together video, the unboxing video, this was a lot bigger. Today, a little bit of tinkering, he slotted in much more perfectly. He still looks very good over here. I don't think so. I think even, he doesn't look like he's leaning at all. And the height here fits nicely. A millimeter is not going to turn and take care of this. This is very drastic. Again, when I was fiddling around yesterday, I actually took Magneto off of the base completely. I just manipulated the cape. And to get this cape onto that peg, it put the cape at this angle where this thing here was literally like that. It's just ridiculous. There's just no way. And somehow, they just didn't quite engineer it properly or whatnot, or there was a little bit of variation in the capes that were made. But in this cape, there's no way you can put that there. So that's a problem. However, my feeling is, let's just say you return the cape, maybe you get a whole new statue, whatever. Even if you have a scenario where this cape can fit into the peg, it doesn't fit all the way in. It's not like it goes all the way to the stone pillar. It goes in, I think, at most, maybe 2 millimeters, and this entire pillar is not more than 3 millimeters. Let me tell you something, 2 millimeters of that little tiny peg in this little tiny hole, that 2 millimeters is not going to save you from the tremendous weight of that cape as it begins to bear down due to the weakness of this leg, okay? The problem, guys, is not the cape and the peg and the hole. The problem is the leg. If this leg was rock solid, you don't need anything else. You don't need this peg in the background. But if this right leg is not rock solid, then it doesn't matter that this is there. Over time, you're not going to be able to beat physics and gravity and mass. Eventually, I'll tell you what's going to happen is that this thing's going to want to lean, and all the weight then is, because again, since the leg is not able to support it, where are you going to support it? There's nothing under here, right? This is gone. So you can't have any help from here. And so therefore, with this basically buckling, all the pressure goes on this little steel rod. Now, how do you think that's going to turn out? It's a little tiny sharp rod, sharp focus, a focal point. What will happen is, if it's in the hole, it's just going to essentially rip right out of the hole. Like a little tiny 2 millimeter chunk of resin is going to fly right off, and then this thing will continue to lean. So I don't trust this. I don't think this thing is really going to take care of the problem. If you wanted to take care of the problem, you needed to make it a little bit more, how can I say, it can't be this subtle. there needs to be a thicker peg, there needs to be a better hole, and this cape has to be, the statue has to be engineered essentially around this point as well. And it's tough, guys, it's tough. You want to make the leg over here, a big metal rod, he's floating, you got 2 holes in here, big holes, where the cape has to slot, and then you also have to, with this gigantic billowing cape, you then have to then also create a 3rd area of a peg and hole. That requires actually some pretty precise engineering, and I think is a little bit too much perhaps for the factory to do that. So they had to make it a little tiny thing. And again, I think some pieces, some people got fitting fine, but I know that there are some collectors who got it. The cape did not fit into that peg very easily. And as you can see from my particular sample, it's not even close. And again, I don't think this is because of a lean or because of warping. I think it's just kind of the way it was made. Now, there's supposed to be, again, I mentioned this thing here. This is one more rod, and you can see that it is touching the undersurface of the cape. Again, I'm going to tell you right now, if that weight pushes on this little thing right here, first of all, there's like a millimeter between the tip of that steel rod and the cape itself. It needs to really sit, I think, right over here to even have a good chance of supporting it. But even if it's perfect, even if, let's just say it's here to here, right? Like I said, the whole cape is to move a little bit over. Even if that's perfect, understand something. This is a very fragile little thing. This is resin. This is not metal. It's this little tiny 2 millimeter diameter resin rod. This is not going to hold, again, the weight of this cape, even if you have that in conjunction with a little tiny rod here. I think, it's not feasible to expect this and this to overcome the fact that this is simply not sufficient from an engineering point of view to support this whole thing here. So there are accounts, of this piece leaning. And the question is, again, is it because of the environment that these statues are placed? Remember, there are international collectors everywhere, and the world is very different, weather-wise, humidity-wise, temperature-wise. Is it inevitable, is the question. And if I live, for instance, in the desert in Southern California, did that just basically delay the inevitable? Or is it something where I could literally just take a chance and have it float in midair and not have anything happen? And I think it varies. And I think if you live in an optimum environment and you have the cape perfectly placed, so it's got, a little bit of support from this rod and the rod in the back, it may stay like this for quite a long time, maybe forever, hard to say. But if there's anything that's going against you, if the cape isn't perfectly aligned, if you don't have the hole in the peg taken care of, if your temperature, your humidity in your environment is just a little bit off, I think this guy's gonna lean. And as he leans, he's gonna eventually break on you. You can try to do the blow dryer to make it more malleable, put it back into its original position, but understand something. You'll blow dry, you cool, you blow dry, eventually you're gonna snap. You're gonna snap it, okay? Because the resin cannot be cured like this back and forth, back and forth. You need support. There's a gentleman who repaired this, the statue, and if you repair it again, then of course you can do all sorts of things. You can fill the inside of this leg with epoxy. You can make it rock solid. You can put in additional, steel rods. You can reinforce this entire area all the way up to the crotch of the hip, to the point where it's so solid that you're going to be able to withstand again the weight. It's still a bit risky, but it can be done. But that's of course going to cost you a lot of money. This is like major surgery, okay, guys? That's like major orthopedic surgery for you to basically rip this leg apart, redo everything, put in the rods, and then paint camouflage again. That's not going to be cheap. And unfortunately, if you're utilizing those services, you probably have one that leaned or broke. The simplest solution, which the company probably later on realized, is to just not take that chance. The simplest solution is to use the little, rocky pillar that you get with the statue. It's on the lid. It's on the top lid. You have to flip it over. It's on a little compartment there. You put it in place. There's a little bit of felt to protect the foot from scratching. You put it here, and again, it's just so simple because you might think it's not a big deal, but it's a huge deal. A little something like that makes all the difference because now you have two areas where it is holding it up, and these two areas, one here, distributes the weight. And now you take that center of gravity, which is all the way from here, try to topple the statue, and just this little tiny support, you move the center of gravity from here, boom, all the way to here, right down the center, and this guy's not gonna lean. He can't. As much as he wants to lean over, this support is preventing him from doing so, okay? Now, you may worry that he might lean backwards, but you can see here that there is just enough gravity here where his arm this way, the chest, the body, there's enough of weight here to counteract the weight here. Make no mistake, there's still a little bit more weight here, but remember, the cape also moves forward a little bit. So the center of gravity is not here. The center of gravity is probably maybe around here or so. And that's, I think, gonna be enough. Again, with the extra support of this little pillar down there, it's gonna keep him centered, keep him from leaning backward. Again, the fear of the statue is you don't want him to lean this way. You don't want him to lean toward his left. You don't want him to lean backward. And I think, again, with that support here, you're gonna prevent that from happening. So you have a situation where, in my opinion, you've got to use this. In my opinion, it shouldn't be optional. It's got to be used because it's going to prevent him from toppling in the long run. And I think that's something really important to talk about in the video. You can shoot a video and just talk for half an hour, an hour. This lean could take months. It could take years. In some unlucky collector's hands, it took maybe weeks. But we're talking about 6, 7, 8 months that this thing finally eventually begins to do this. So you can do a YouTube video, for instance, and talk about it. You can take this away and get a real wow factor. But in reality, when I went to the group that the producers group, almost every collector showcased this guy with this pillar in place. I think it's critical that you have it in place. You may be tempted to try not to have it if you have a cape that actually rests against the little peg there, for whatever reason. They create this little thing, the casting is a little bit different, everything's a little bit different, that the cape is just a little bit different in terms of its flexibility, the foot, the ankle, and you're able to take that cape and just kind of do this a little bit, and you rest it in there. You might be tempted, you might think that this thing can do it. I'm telling you right now, I don't think that those two things are gonna do it. Even if they're perfect, use the support. So I went on a little bit, I think too much about that, but I think it's just critical because this is an amazing statue. Again, my favorite, but you have to protect yourself from this particular issue. And again, I think the company should be commended for being so ambitious. They put together one of the most ambitious Magneto statues ever made. I'm gonna wait until the white Magneto comes in hand. I think this trumps XM's white Magneto in terms of the effect. I haven't seen a better, levitating mags. Even more better than the Mad X Magneto, which is more stately, a little bit more, calm, simpler based to some extent. But I think this trumps that. So this is one of the best levitation effects I've ever seen. But in doing so, the factory maybe cut a little bit too many corners. It didn't have quite the understanding of what it would take to make this work. And so, or maybe they did know what would make it work and they decided it would be cheaper just to give you this guy right here rather than do all of this nonsense I talked about up here. But be that as it may, certain compromises couldn't be made. You can't compromise on the cape. And so therefore, you have to deal with the support structure. So that was a pretty long review video. Hopefully you definitely got an idea of how much I like the piece, of all the details of the piece, all the engineering. This is something I love to talk about because it's so complicated. There's so much going on with it. Both the good, of which there's many, and also one or two bads, of which there's a pretty critical one that you have to discuss. But that's kind of why I like to do statue reviews and talk about it, because going really in depth on these pieces is what it's all about, to me at least. So I hope you found that somewhat useful for new collectors or new people who are going to buy the piece. This is a very sought after piece. They only made 97 of them. It is, again, by consensus, one of the best Magnetos, 1A or 1B. There's going to be a lot of people who still want this piece. And so before you spend the money on acquiring it, hopefully, both my earlier videos showing you how to build it, and then this video talking about, again, the good and the bad and the support structure and the reality of it, and showing you close up the areas that we're talking about and whether it's going to work or not. Hopefully all of that goes into your decision-making process. And when you do get it, you get it with eyes wide open, understanding what could be happening and how to prevent that from happening. I have no regrets, on buying it because this is still, like I said, it's the best Magneto in my mind that's out there. But hopefully, everything that I've done over the last 2 videos is going to help you and gives you a definitive sort of info dump on this piece. Okay, so until my next review, I hope you enjoy that. Best Magneto on the market, and take care.